In the 1960s, a second wave of folk revivalism swept throughout the United States. Artists like Bob Dylan, Peter, Paul and Mary, and Joan Baez, who emerged from the Greenwich Village folk scene, became national symbols of protest, first for civil rights and then against the Vietnam War, through public large-scale events like the 1963 March on Washington. The national notoriety and commercial success that Bob Dylan and his contemporaries brought to folk music tied the genre even more closely with radical political ideology and protest. By 1969, however, folk revivalism began to wane as psychedelic rock and the counterculture hippie movement grew in popularity. In Houston's Montrose district, however, Anderson Fair Retail Restaurant was just opening in 1969. Anderson Fair, along with venues like Sand Mountain Coffee House, the Jester Lounge, and the Old Quarter, became the center of a thriving and eclectic hippie counterculture movement that developed a unique folk sound. Through folk music venues such as Anderson Fair, Montrose musicians carried on the folk revival while adding a unique Southern character.
If I were a carpenter, you were a lady, would you marry me anyway? Would you have my baby?
One of the biggest services that arose in the wake of the folk revival of the 60s, when things died down, one of the biggest services was performed by those folks who provided the stages, who kept the doors open so Dave Van Ronk could continue to sing for an audience. And not just Dave Van Ronk, but those people who learned from Dave Van Ronk and wanted to write new songs, so that Robert Earl Keen could find a stage when nobody was listening to him, or Nancy Griffith.
While Texan songwriters were inspired by New York greats like Bob Dylan and Dave Van Ronk, they also borrowed musical elements from traditional Southern cowboy songs and country music to create an eclectic sound. This revival of Southern roots was seen in lyrical themes as well. Most of Houston's folk musicians left behind the protest themes of the previous decade and instead sang about life, death, and love in the South. Imagery dealing with the natural world and rural life pervaded many songs by Houston folk singers.
On the road, my friend, was gonna keep you free and clean. Now you wear your skin like iron and your breath's as hard as kerosene. You weren't your mama's only son, but her favorite one, it seems. She began to cry when you said goodbye.
According to Houston record producer and music historian Bill Bentley, the hippie community developed in Montrose after many native Texans moved out of the area and low rents drew in Bohemians. Bentley claims that through exploration of drugs such as LSD, this Bohemian community evolved into a thriving hippie community.
Morning, when this world is over, I'll fly away to that land on God's celestial shore. I'll fly away, oh Lordy, I'll fly away.
In regard to Montrose's hippie scene in the 1970s, folk singer Lucinda Williams has said that,
I mean, it was really like something out of what some people might imagine San Francisco was like in the mid-'60s. It was kind of like that, except it was only happening there at Anderson Fair. You know, it's just like this kind of big world, but within a little bubble.
so with Houston folk musicians embracing psychedelic hippie culture and their Texan roots, how folk was Houston's folk scene? Truthfully, the folk musicians living in Montrose were just as radical as the folk musicians in the heart of Greenwich Village. In the documentary For the Sake of the Song, Houston folk singer Eric Taylor called Anderson Fair and the surrounding area
kind of like a little political watering hole. It was the reason that they had it. And a place for people to sit down and talk about things that would probably get them arrested somewhere else.
It was when people were starting to find their voice. We were all running around fighting the war in Vietnam, and we had underground newspapers and alternative radio stations, and there was all this stuff happening. The Ku Klux Klan was shooting at us. A lot of the people who had been out in the streets got involved in electoral politics, and a lot of that happened right here.
While Montrose's hippie folk scene fostered a strong liberal spirit, It didn't yield the same volume of protest music as the folk scene in Greenwich Village because of changing times and a different focus. After the Vietnam War ended in 1973, protest music as a whole declined. Montrose's folk singers were serious songwriters, to be sure, but most of them nostalgically embraced the traditional country music lyrical style of story through song. The folklorist Joseph C. Codlow asserts that folk culture is a universal quality to be found in the same degree in all races, countries, sections, and occupations. He says that all have folk tales and folk songs, all sing of work, death, heroes, and love. Houston folk songs like Poncho and Lefty thus celebrate Texan folklore by retelling stories of work, death, heroes, and love that pertain to the people of Texas. And that's certainly folk music, whether or not it resembles our traditional perception of the genre.